This video is brought to you by Adorama.com. Hello and welcome. You find yourself looking through the Vortex Crossfire 2 4-12 by 44. We again start this video by starting off on a snapshot, so I can briefly say that there isn't going to be much content to this, or at least varying content, primarily because of how niche this scope is. Just like the Leupold VX Freedom 4-12 that I just reviewed, there isn't a whole lot of features on this scope, so as a result, it's going to be kind of quick. And with that, let's start the video. Just like the VX Freedom, this scope has a fixed parallax of 100 yards, so that means that anything inside 100 yards is going to be kind of out of focus. This power transformer is of roughly 30 yards, and you can see at 4x it's not terrible, but when we zoom all the way into 12x, everything becomes very out of focus. That is due to the fixed parallax, and that is going to be something that I'm going to be showcasing throughout this entire video, because that's one of the biggest downsides of having a fixed parallax scope like this. Now we're going to focus our attention on a 400-yard steel door that's 80 inches tall. Now, at this distance, everything should be fairly well in focus. Not picture perfect, but definitely usable. Now that we're zoomed into 12x, you can see what the problem is. It's a very soft image. Contrast isn't really there, and the sharpness and clarity of everything is certainly lacking. But that's a two-part problem. However, before we get into that, look at the chromatic aberration on the top of the white brick when we go over the brown brick right there. That does pop up in a lot of the video, which you're going to take note of. Shifting our focus, we're now looking at power lines that are roughly 40 yards, a tree line that's roughly 200 yards, and that power tower all the way off in the distance, which is roughly 700 yards. Zooming into 12x, and you can clearly see what distance this scope is favoring. That 200 to 300 yard tree line is very clear, yet everything else is certainly out of focus. One thing that's really nice about this scope at 4x, though, is that there's very little distortion to the image. What you primarily see is a lot of parallax shift between things at different distances when you pan across the scope like this. You also get a sense for the eye box, which at 4x seems to be fairly large and forgiving. It's a very good performance so far, a scope at this price point, which is roughly $170. And like I was saying before, that two-part problem, that's one of it. You have to remember that this scope is very inexpensive. This being a super niche scope, just like the VX Freedom, I think it would be limited to who would be really looking for it. But if you're the type of person that's going to be buying this for hunting, how does the reticle work in dense tree lines? And here you can see it works halfway decent at 4x, but I still think it's a little bit too finite. Even when you zoom into 12x, it still doesn't have the girth that makes it easier to pick up to the eye. If the scope had illumination, it would be, of course, a different story, but because it does not, we're sort of limited on what we could really use it for. And here, I don't think this reticle is very suited for in conditions like this. But what about if you're going to be shooting it on a range inside of 100 yards like we are here at 50 yards? Again, at 4x, it is not a terrible performance, but that's because the lower the magnification, the less you have to worry about things having a parallax problem. However, the farther away from the minimum magnification that you have, the worse you're going to notice the parallax problem. And here, once we get past 4x, things start to have problems. That fixed parallax of 100 yards is not going to be ideal for situations like this. However, to the naked eye, your eye can shift between the target and the reticle a lot better than a camera can with fixed settings. However, that's not really ideal for any sort of situation. Now let's take a look at the eye box performance at 4x. Here, again, just like you saw before, 4x is very open and easy to get behind. It's a very good performance, and it's really nice to be able to snap to it in a hurry. 8x is pretty good here. It's a much better performance than the VX Freedom had at this magnification. Another thing that I didn't really talk about yet is that there's no issues with shifting between lowest to maximum magnification. The eye box does not change whatsoever. However, at 12x, you best be behind it absolutely perfectly, because if not, you're not going to be able to really look through it. Again, this is a $170 scope with a 1-inch tube. There's only so much performance you can expect out of a scope with those two characteristics. Now we're going to shift our focus on a more finite target at some distance. This is roughly 600 to 700 yards, and it is a speed limit sign. At 4x, you can see everything looks okay, but once we zoom in, a lot of the image loses its edge, and it becomes quite dull. Now, I'm sure some of you are saying it's because it's a gloomy day out, but I can assure you it is not the only reason behind this. The scope definitely favors distances between 100 to 200 yards. Anything beyond that, and it sort of falls apart. But now, how does it track? I'm going to actually let the video overlay go for this one. Whoa, that's a common problem. Put the tracks back to 0. Yep, you got a problem. It does not like going left. I'm jogging the windage back and forth. I don't know if you could hear the turrets. It's returning back to zero well. It's going back to the zero on the turret itself. But every time I go left, it's going a little bit more, and then there's a bit of a lag. So let's see if you could pick up the noise. And the reticle stopped moving, yet I can still move the turret. And it's about 1 click off, I would say, which is a quarter MOA. After doing all of that, and doing that ramp. But right there, it's at zero again, and it seems to do pretty good. Let's do elevation one more time just for shits and giggles. Back down to 6. Perfect. Elevation's good. Windage is actually not half bad, but there's not enough adjustability to the right. A very interesting performance indeed. Now, one thing I'd like to note there, the only thing I had to adjust was the focus on the camera and the rear ocular adjustment on the scope itself. That's why nothing was really in focus. Now let's move this scope to an area where it's going to feel more suited. We are looking at 100-yard paper targets, and those bushes are roughly 20 to 25 yards away. We're looking through it at 4x, and we're about to zoom in all the way to 12x. Now, like I was saying before, the image does get soft at 12x at certain distances. Here at 100 yards, the image does look pretty good. But once we start panning across to the right at the steel targets in the berm at roughly 190 yards, you're going to start to notice that it doesn't seem as sharp. Now, the VX Freedom here was extremely sharp. This Crossfire 2 does appear to be more muted, both with colors and sharpness. And no one can even begin to argue that it's not too nice of a day out. It is a perfect sunny day, and this was filmed just after I filmed the Leopold. If you notice that plume of dust kick up just there, it looked more like a big blob as opposed to a finite collection of dust particles. And here it's very clear to see that those steel targets have very little character through them when you're looking through this scope. I think this scope's parallax is a little bit favoring before 100 yards, and that's why once we get beyond it, it does appear to not be as in focus. Yet here at the 200-yard paper, you can see that there's very clear delineation between all the rings from the X-ring out. It's actually a pretty good performance, but when we pan over to the 300-yard section, you're going to see that this scope doesn't perform that good. And I don't know why, but this is the only scope of the day that I had some sort of haziness in front of it. It wasn't in direct sunlight, and in that area, I had been able to get pretty good image quality with several different scopes. However, this one does seem murky. I even come down a little bit to see if it was something to do with my angle, but it didn't seem to be the case. Very oddball performance here, and as a result, you can barely make out those steel targets at 320 yards. Now, there's a couple things that I like about the scope, the reticle being one of them. I haven't really touched on that yet. I really like the delineation on the lines itself. It doesn't crowd it or make it feel too busy. But that's about it. And I think on that note, let's get into my final thoughts. The Vortex Crossfire 2 4-12x44 is a $170 scope. And that's the biggest thing that you have to remember. How does this scope perform for its price point? At $170 or so, it performs extremely well in my opinion. Yes, the glass clarity isn't that of the VX Freedom, which I just reviewed, but that scope is around $370. And again, though that scope has incredible good-looking glass, when you change it from 4 to 12x, the eye relief changes. And that's something that I just have a very difficult time wrapping my head around, especially for a scope of that price. Granted, that is made in America. This is made in China. How else do you expect to get a scope like this for so cheap, though? You got to cut corners somewhere. However, that's about the only limiting factor about this, is just how the glass performs above and beyond 200 or so yards. Everything else seems to work fairly good. Everything from the adjustable eyepiece, the magnification ring, and even the turrets. Though the windage turret does do the ramp thing to the right, but to the left, it actually was jogging over, which was very weird. But it returned to zero well enough to not really be a concern for me. However, if you're not perfectly lined up with this thing on your gun, you're going to run into windage issues. You're probably I do not doubt that someone out there is going to run into a windage issue when they go to zero this. However, the elevation worked perfectly fine, and that's more important in my opinion. Even though this does have a really nice BDC, I actually really like the reticle in this as opposed to the tri-MOA reticle of the Leopold VX Freedom. The lines are spaced well enough apart that you can actually see in between each line, as opposed to the tri-MOA, which is just, they're so tight that it's hard to get a real good view on your target and or your bullet splash if you're not holding over high enough. Now, as far as weight goes, I made an error on my VX Freedom video. The Crossfire 2 comes in at just about 16 ounces, and just for comparison's sake, the VX Freedom is nearly 3 ounces lighter. Now, 3 ounces might not seem like a lot, but if you are using this scope on a hunting rig or on a lightweight carbine, 3 ounces makes a big difference. It's almost the difference of these 30mm high rings from Monstrum. These are just over 5 ounces. If there were a 1-inch ring, which they would need to be for these scopes, and they were lows, you'd bet that they'd be closer to the difference of the optic. So for the money, you get a fairly lightweight, decent image quality 4-12 variable. Again, I like the reticle. I like a lot of things about it. It has its quirks, don't get me wrong, but for the price, I feel it performs fairly well. Would I use this for anything? Honestly, no, because I don't see myself ever having a hunting scope that I'm going to need a 4-12. If I was to do something like that, it would be a much lower magnification range. Even like a 2-7 would probably be perfect for what I would need it for. But if this fits your niche requirements, your specifications, it's a pretty decent scope for the money. As far as this being better than the VX Freedom, you got to weigh out your options as far as price and weight. More so the price. This is less than half the price of the VX Freedom. And it doesn't have the same issues as the VX Freedom. It, of course, has its own issues. That being that the image quality is a little bit lacking. But as far as everything else goes, it performs well enough. Anyway, that's going to conclude this video. A huge thank you from all of you for voting for this scope to be reviewed, and a huge thank you again from Adorama.com for sending this in for review and making this video possible. And as always, thank you very much for watching. See you again next time. And a huge thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Without you, this wouldn't be possible.